Hi, my name is Dr. Kylie Harris. I'm from Australia, and this is a pre-recorded presentation. So I would just really like to thank the organisers of this conference for being flexible enough to allow me to do this and present my work. I will explain a little bit further in my presentation why I'm doing this as a pre-recording. But for now, I'm just going to start sharing my screen so I can share some slides with you. So I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connections to land, waters and culture. We pay our respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. A little bit about me. I'm a research psychologist, a writer and an activist from Australia. My academic work focuses on the interface between spirituality and mental health. And I'm currently investigating how this relationship is influenced by issues of social and racial justice. Okay, so just to set some context, somebody once told me, if your life is not worth writing a book about, you are not living it properly. I can't quite remember, but it may have been the same person who told me that when you are an artist, you can be as crazy as you like. And somehow these two poignant comments have shaped my adult life. I did try the whole struggling artist thing, but after a few years, it did become a little bit, well, not so much boring, but financially unfeasible. So I decided to become an academic instead. And this was largely based upon my personal journey of mental struggles as a way of trying to understand my own experience. Intent on figuring myself out, I ended up discovering the transpersonal work of Stan and Christina Groff, who introduced me to the concepts of spiritual emergence and emergency. Through my own research, I have formulated a definition of spiritual emergence, which refers to a process of integrating spiritual awareness and experience. For example, mystical and paranormal phenomena, unusual emotional and physical sensations. And this process generally facilitates positive transformation and growth. However, if the process occurs very rapidly or if it's triggered suddenly, such as via a traumatic experience or event, it may become unmanageable and an individual may experience states of crisis involving psychological distress, coping difficulties, and a lack of understanding by self and or others. And then severe cases may exhibit symptoms that are commonly diagnosed as clinical psychosis. So in other words, when a process of spiritual emergence becomes a crisis, it is then referred to as a spiritual emergency. So through a series of synchronistic events, I fell into a PhD examining the relationships between spiritual emergency, psychosis, and personality. And through my research, I've discovered that when a mental health crisis is reframed, such as from psychosis to spiritual emergency, it can actually offer an individual a sense of hope that perhaps their experience is part of their own personal process of awakening. And what I've found is that shifting away from an illness model of interpretation can offer immense healing potential for people and can allow the process to unfold more naturally. For example, through my research and through my own personal experience, I found that a central feature of these experiences is their potential to facilitate transformation and growth for an individual. So here are some quotes from participants in my research who identify as having experienced a personal psychological crisis that they themselves felt was a spiritual emergence or emergency. So some of those quotes include vibrant aliveness and sense of deep relief, peace and awe, feeling more at peace and in awe at the joy of life than ever before, a sense of well-being and inner security, connectivity to that to which one is not connected in the normal state. There is no way of putting into words how that felt. A real sense of vocation. All crises are potentially transformative and the emergency crisis is leading to positive transformation and emergence. And every crisis holds the potential for healing and growth. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, it feels like we're in a state of global psychosis, or reframed, a state of global spiritual emergency. So this has profound implications for all of us as individuals and how we can reframe our individual experiences and apply the lessons to current world events and circumstances. So applying individual experiences to the collective. Transpersonal writers have been discussing the concept of global spiritual emergency for decades, but it has never felt more true than it does today. So how do we cope when we awaken to the idea that we are living in an insane world? Are we as individuals crazy? Or are we part of a collective madness, a culturally self-inflicted dream state asylum within which we are increasingly desperate to awaken? And what does that awakening process look like? So here I am during the birth of my son, who is now 5 years old. His birth was definitely a catalyst for spiritual emergency for me. So prior to his birth, a few years before that, I had experienced an episode of crisis and had integrated it to some degree, but I would say not completely, because my childbirth experience brought it all up again. And this included depression, anxiety, and symptoms of post-traumatic stress. I experienced a lot of what I would consider to be traumatic past life memories, which were triggered by a traumatic childbirth experience, and then a whole cocktail of mind-altering pain relief drugs, which basically brought about a whole lot of visionary experiences. During my earlier crisis, I had experienced a lot of physical symptoms, such as adrenal and chronic fatigue, digestive issues, and thyroid issues. And during this time, I also experienced a lot of psychic and paranormal phenomena. So these days, my generalized anxiety has generalized towards the looming climate crisis. And this has included a high degree of eco-anxiety, grief, and existential dread. I've also discovered that I score very highly on a personality trait known as schizotypy. Schizotypy refers to a personality trait that includes such concepts as magical thinking, unusual perceptual experiences, dissociation, eccentricity, and loose boundaries. And it's also a trait that supposedly predisposes people to the experience of clinical psychosis. So for me personally, when my schizotypal tendencies get all mixed up with cognitive disorganization, or in other words, when my mind is a mess, I become pretty damn crazy. And my husband will attest to that. But I also think that it's highly schizotypal individuals who have the capacity to change the world. And the reason I say that is because schizotypy in the research is also highly correlated with creativity. So going back to my original quotes about being an artist and creativity, I believe that during this process of global spiritual emergency or global psychosis, however we choose to view it and frame it, I personally believe that creativity is going to play a really important role in transforming as individuals and transforming collectively. So for me personally, most days, I just want the world to wake up so that I can feel more normal, because being normal really just means being the same as everyone else. But the current normal just doesn't work for me. And where is the fun in being normal? I feel like I'm in an anthropological experiment a lot of the time, but I'm a blind participant as well as a blind researcher. So basically, I feel like sometimes an alien on this planet and I just have no idea what's going on. Now, when I started to realize that my experience was very much wrapped up in the climate emergency, I came across the work of Australian philosopher Glenn Albrecht, who is the author of the book Earth Emotions. Glenn has created new words that address environmentally induced mental distress and physical illness, which he terms psychoterratic and somaterratic. So Glenn defines psychoterratic illness as a negative relationship to our home environment, be it at local, regional, or global scales. This negative relationship involves a loss of identity, loss of an endemic sense of place, and a decline in well-being. One of Glenn's negative psychoterratic terms is solastalgia, which refers to the pain or sickness caused by the ongoing loss of solace and the sense of desolation connected to the present state of one's home territory. So Glenn describes it as the lived experience of negative emotional change manifest as an attack on one's sense of place. Unlike the dislocated spatial and temporal dimensions of nostalgia, which has partly inspired this term, solastalgia is the homesickness that you have when you are still at home, but your home environment is changing. So Glenn has also created a positive psychoterratic term called solophilia, which is like a counter to solastalgia. And it refers to the love of the totality of our place relationships and a willingness to accept the political responsibility for them at all scales. So when I realized that I was experiencing a high degree of solastalgia, and then discovered that there was an alternative emotion that I could transform into or shift into, I set about figuring out how to do that. And around this time, I also discovered the work of climate psychologist Margaret Klein-Salomon, who introduced the concept of emergency mode. Emergency mode has implications for both the climate emergency and also states of spiritual emergency, especially when these experiences are all wrapped up together, as mine have been. So Margaret describes emergency mode as the mode of human functioning that occurs when individuals or groups respond optimally to existential or moral emergencies. Emergency mode is characterized by flow states, which refer to optimal states of consciousness, characterized by heightened focus, perception, and abilities. And the psychologist who originally coined the term flow describes these states as being completely involved in an activity for its own sake. The ego falls away, time flies. Every action, movement, and thought follows inevitably from the previous one. Your whole being is involved and you're using your skills to the utmost. So as I've tried to shift from solastalgia into solophilia, I realized that emergency mode plays a large role in that process, because when we are in an individual state of crisis, emergency mode is the mode of functioning that we kind of need to operate in order to get through the crisis. It's when we're just really, really focused on solving the crisis. And so if we do extrapolate that from the individual to the collective, as Margaret proposes, in order to solve the climate crisis, which essentially is part of this whole global spiritual emergency, we really need to be shifting into emergency mode on a collective scale. So this then speaks to the concept of, what the research on spiritual emergency can tell us from how it looks on the individual level to how it looks on the collective, and how individuals can navigate the experience, and then how collectively we might be able to navigate this experience. So I like to think of it as, from the individual level, you've got like a light bulb turning on for a person when they start to awaken. And then I like to try and imagine light bulbs turning on all over the place as we start to shift from the individual into that more collective space. So for example, we start with an individual paradigm shift, which is essentially what spiritual emergency facilitates for people. It facilitates an individual paradigm shift in the sense that an individual needs to basically reframe the world through a different lens, because they are changing, they are transforming within themselves. And so there is no normal anymore. What their previous normal looked like, it just doesn't exist anymore. It's a transformation. And so we can call that a paradigm shift, a cognitive paradigm shift for an individual. And then when we do start to extrapolate from the individual to the collective, what we can see is that as more and more people start to have these experiences individually, this starts to extend beyond one person to a few more people supporting one another. And then we can start to see collectives being formed. And suddenly we start to see collective social movements whereby large-scale social changes start to become feasible. And this can stem from grassroots initiatives inspired by these personal experiences of transformation and awakening. In his book, How Soon Is Now, philosopher and radical futurist Daniel Pinchbeck suggests that the ecological crisis represents a rite of passage for humanity. So just like a spiritual emergency experience can be like a rite of passage for an individual, what Pinchbeck suggests is that humanity has essentially subconsciously self-inflicted the climate emergency as a way of facilitating our own collective transformation, our own collective rite of passage. He proposes that Western society has lost its way due to our loss of ritual and initiatory ordeals, such as those traditionally practiced in Indigenous cultures. And he suggests that we can only survive and thrive if we can learn to view ourselves as one planetary tribe, and proposes that a people's movement could transform society. So with all of this in mind, based on my own personal experience and what I witness in others and speak to others about, At this point in time, I propose that we need to acknowledge two things to get this type of collective transformation underway. The first is that we have the power, and the second is that the time is now. So drawing from the work of people like Daniel Pinchbeck and the concept of rites of passage and initiatory ordeals, my own spiritual journey has led me to want to learn everything I can about Indigenous cosmology, traditional practices and healing, as I realise how much colonisation has contributed to our state of global psychosis and impending ecological doom. So obviously for me here in Australia, that involves connecting with Indigenous Australians or Indigenous Aboriginals. And so here I am with my son and with one of my Indigenous elder friends who is performing a smoking ceremony for us. And that's been a beautiful experience to be a part of and to introduce to my family and to our wider community. As a way of further exploring these concepts and bringing them into the climate and mental health conversation, I've recently established, along with a group of colleagues, a new research and educational centre called the Australian Centre for Consciousness Studies. The centre has been inspired by the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium, or EPRC, which is an international collaboration among academics and researchers, as well as others working towards the common goal of bringing together clinical, scientific and spiritual paradigms to improve clinical outcomes for individuals experiencing spiritual emergence and emergency. And one of the concepts that I intend to explore through my own research moving forward is that of the concept of human rewilding. So the concept of rewilding is about reversing the process of domestication and returning to a more wild state. It involves restoring ways of living that foster enhanced health and well-being for both ourselves and the ecosystem. And it involves a return to our senses, to ourselves and to our natural world, of which we have always been a part. So to put this into some context, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a pre-recorded presentation. And the reason I'm doing a pre-recorded presentation instead of joining you all live, which I wish I could do, is because I'm currently in quarantine with my 5-year-old son and our kitten in Hobart, Tasmania. We made a snap decision to move away from the mainland where COVID is becoming increasingly more problematic and move down to Tasmania where we have some bushland and where we're currently building an off-grid hobbit house and a permaculture farm. So for a city slicker like me, this is all a little bit terrifying. This is my family's personal rewilding experience. Yeah, kind of moving out of the city and going wild because I feel like the land is calling me. I wasn't born in Tasmania, but I feel that I have some kind of sacred connection to the land here. And I don't fully understand this connection, but what I do know is that it's calling me. And just being here feels incredibly healing. Being in quarantine feels like a holiday, actually. It does feel like a return. It feels like coming home. So, you know, I imagine that I'll figure out what all of this means as I undertake this rewilding experience in real time. But I don't think it's going to take me too long to look like this wild woman here. So going back to the quotes that I shared at the beginning of the presentation, I think that I've tried to live my life in a way that is worth writing a book about. And sometimes I might have taken that a bit too far because that has taken me into crisis and trauma quite a lot, which has made me wonder whether a good book requires crisis and trauma to be engrossing. It certainly seems that a lot of people have become addicted to the drama, which I certainly was for a while. However, I actually don't think that we need crisis and trauma in order to transform our society into one of sustainability and spiritual growth. You know, I tried the struggling artist thing, then I stepped into my crazy. And so I guess now where I've come to in my personal journey and in my work is that I'm just speaking my truth. I actually can't hold it in any longer. It's pouring out. So my work these days involves combining my inner artist and my inner crazy, owning them both and just seeing what emerges. And finally, in my efforts towards achieving a state of soliphilia, I have co-authored an open letter with some of my amazing colleagues, Catherine Lucas, Mick Collins, and Paul Levy. So this letter is titled The Rebirth of People and Planet in a Time of Global Emergency. And it's an open letter from the spiritual emergency community. So in the letter, we discuss the topics, like some of the topics and issues that I've briefly covered here today, such as spiritual emergency, planetary emergency, spiritual crisis, emergency mode, the importance of Indigenous wisdom. Essentially, what the letter is about is declaring that humanity is facing a state of planetary emergency, which requires a global consciousness revolution in order to bring about our evolution, and that this needs to be undertaken in emergency mode and guided by Indigenous and other wisdom traditions. So within this letter, we also link to a petition. And when we reach 100,000 signatures, we plan to send the petition to the UN as a message from concerned citizens to declare a state of planetary emergency. So as Glenn explains in his concept of solophilia, it's really about becoming political, because I really don't think that this collective transformation can occur without being political. So one of the purposes of the open letter is to really promote this concept of solophilia, because there are a lot of, I guess, misunderstandings about the concept of emergency mode. A lot of people think that it is a state of anxiety and panic, and so they're really reluctant to step into it. But actually, emergency mode is really an important part of stepping into solophilia, because it's when you really start to harness your own power. And that can be, a really empowering experience for people. So part of the intention of the open letter is that we really want to guide people through this state of crisis, this collective crisis, which is manifesting for people on the individual level, and all of the negative emotions and processes that the climate emergency is catalyzing. In this light, in this sense of kind of global spiritual emergency. So we want people to feel empowered as part of a collective that is taking practical action to address the issues that we are all facing. You know, none of us are doing this alone. This is a collective crisis that we're all facing. And I suppose people are awakening at different levels. But, essentially, I think COVID has really shown us what it looks like to face a collective crisis. So this particular letter can be found pinned to the top of my social media profiles, which I'll share in a moment. So if you feel inclined, please check it out, please sign the petition, and please share it widely, because the time is now. So in conclusion, the process of awakening is ongoing. It certainly has been for me. I do not claim to be awakened, I claim to be awake. If there is indeed a difference. But if anyone would like to contact me to find out any more about my work, or any of the things that I've discussed here today, you can find me on social media. I've tried to keep it very easy. Dr. Kylie Harris is my handle. You can also reach out to me via email. And I love receiving emails from people, and I do my best to respond to everyone. So please do get in contact with me. I would love to share my work. I would love to hear people's experiences, because that's all part of the work as well. It's really about collective storytelling, collective sharing, peer support. This is what a collective social movement looks like. So thank you very much once again. I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much once again to the conference organisers for allowing me to do this remotely. Thank you to my beautiful friend, Shoshana Bryn Jones-Square, who was a keynote speaker for this conference, for inviting me to share my story. Thank you for bearing with me while I'm in quarantine with my son just asleep in the other part of the room there. And I hope that everyone enjoys the conference. Thank you very much.